speaker this evening is Dr. Hilary Ballon. Dr. Ballon's scholarship concerns cities and the intersection of architecture, politics, and social life with a focus on New York City. Dr. Ballon received her PhD from MIT and teaches courses on urbanism and planning at the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, where she is a university professor. Dr. Ballon has just returned to the faculty full-time after serving for 9 years as Deputy Vice Chancellor of NYU Abu Dhabi. In that role, she helped to create this new NYU campus, which is now in its 7th year. Before joining NYU, Dr. Ballon had been at Columbia University since 1985 in the Department of Art History and Archaeology, taking on many university leadership roles there as well. Her publications and curatorial work include curating The Greatest Grid, the Master Plan of Manhattan, as well as Robert Moses and the Modern City, which evaluated his physical transformation of New York City in the mid-20th century. Her current project is an exhibition opening in 2 weeks at the Museum of the City of New York, the Future City Lab, which is part of a permanent exhibition called New York at its Core that considers the past, present, and future of the city in 3 galleries. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ballon.
Good evening. I'm not going to speak about the greatest grid tonight, but I wanted to say that if you are interested in looking at the Randall farm maps, there are 96 if I remember the number correctly, these magnificent maps which are in the collection of Manhattan Borough Commissioner's Office, we digitized them for the Greatest Grid exhibition. And after the exhibition, I created a website where you can see, you can click on all of the Randall maps, you can zoom in on them, you can put in a current address and see where it is. The maps cover the island, and we also stitch them together digitally, so instead of, you can either read them as individual folios, as we saw in a couple of slides today, or you can see them put together as a unified map. So I think it's a really fantastic resource. And the monument that Richard showed on this side of the screen, 26th Street monument from the New York Historical Society, was in the exhibition, and you can also learn a little bit more about it in the website of the Greatest Grid. When I did the exhibition, which was in 2011 on the occasion of the bicentennial of the grid, I was informed about one of the bolts, and as I told Marie at the time, I was told not to reveal the location because there was a fear that if it were revealed, someone might pilfer it. So clearly the attitude has changed. Well, my job tonight is rather different. I was asked to speak about the importance of fidelity to the intention of the original artist. So the intention of the original artist. And there is good reason to care about the intention of the artist, or artists in this case, Frederick Law Olmstead and Calvert Vaux, because Central Park is unquestionably a masterpiece like the Guggenheim Museum or a painting by Rembrandt, and the kind of care we give to masterpieces is appropriate for this work of art. And the approach, and here we have portraits of Olmstead and Vox. Vox all too often left out of the story, and then one of the Greensward presentation pieces that you've already seen. The reverence for the work of Olmstead and Vox set in very early, in part because of the work of his son, Frederick Law Olmstead Jr., whom I quote, "My attitude toward matters relating to Central Park differs from my attitude toward most any other problem of landscape architecture, not only because it was the work of my father, but like many of our fellow landscape architects, I feel that Central Park, as the most famous and earliest of our great public parks in the country, has a peculiar and really national importance to our art and profession, and that the protection of its artistic integrity and functional success has a correspondingly national importance for us as artists and professional men." It was on the side, of course, working to establish landscape architecture as a profession, and that professional aspiration is conveyed in those words. He said, the design of Central Park, and these are words from 1927, the design of Central Park should not be changed, notwithstanding the changes in American society. He acknowledged the rise of automobility, the construction of skyscrapers, conditions that obviously didn't exist at the time the park was designed. But he said, his father's intent was to provide a quality completely in contrast with the normal urban condition. Central Park was a great work of art. One does not burn up a Titian or a Rembrandt because he feels more fully in sympathy with John Singer Sargent. But I think there are reasons to question the absolute fidelity to the original intention of the artist in the case of Central Park. For one, Central Park is a landscape, and built into landscape is constant change. This is a detail of the present outlines in the park from the Greensward presentation board. The condition that Olmstead and Vox found, and this is the effect proposed, their intention on how they would transform it. And the radical transformation in many respects of the landscape was something that they could only partially envision, but how that landscape would evolve over time was something that naturally escaped them. At present, there are about 25,000 trees in the park, but only 150 of them are left from the era of the park's designers, a marker of how much maintenance the park over the past century plus has required alteration. The second factor, I think, that calls into question the fidelity to the artist's intention has to do with the embeddedness and integration of the park in the city of New York. It is not an isolated entity, and from the very start, in fact, that was the founder's vision of it, and the comment that Marie made about the integration of the park and the grid, I think is a part of this picture. But the park, because of its heavy use, has had to respond to the visitors who come to the park. And at present, there are about 42 million visitors a year to Central Park, 42 million visitors a year. So you think, how can this park, or how can conservation be separated from that visitation and from the needs of the residents who depend on the park for so many important aspects of their life? And I would say that a third factor contributing to the consideration of the fundamental urban dynamism of the park connected to that of the city relates to the scale of the park. Perhaps in a pocket park, like the two you see on the screen, it is feasible and appropriate to put the intention of the designer first, because it's such a small space, I think it could be dissociated from the most pressing or changing demands that city residents place upon it. But when you are thinking about a park at this, of the size of Central Park, some 843 acres, I think it an unreasonable expectation to dissociate the park from the evolving city. When the park was envisioned, as you know, and as the plan at the top recalls, there was virtually no development around the perimeter of the park. Development in the city was just approaching the southern edge of the park, as one of Marie's slides indicated. By the time these aerial photographs were taken and the park itself was completed, development of the grid had not yet fully extended to the northern tip of the island. The park was still not yet fully surrounded. But of course, that is not the case today. With a city that has fully surrounded and densified around this great lung of Central Park. So my argument is that the scale of the park, its embeddedness in the city, and the built-in change in the landscape are factors that would call into question the reliance on the intention of the artists as the driving consideration. The park itself has been a laboratory for different approaches to the question of artistic intention and conservation strategy. Let me outline 4 different strategies that have been deployed over time. The first is a return to the original design. And I believe this is the approach that the Conservancy took in rebuilding the boat landings in very recent years to reconstruct the original design. The new boat landings replaced ones that had been rebuilt in the 1970s, and what the Conservancy tells us in their description of the most recent reconstruction is that they were able to get closer to the original design than the structures that they replaced. A second strategy is demonstrated by the approach to the Lower Reservoir. And it was the idea behind that project was to return to the original concept, not the original design, but the original concept of a pastoral or rustic park, or as I say more colloquially, what would Olmstead have wanted if he had done this? And this is the condition that you see at in the 1920s of the Lower Reservoir at the time that its fate was under discussion. The Lower Reservoir was built in conjunction with the original Croton Aqueduct system, but by the 1920s, it was no longer functioning. The new Catskill water system had come online, and the Lower Reservoir was ready to be decommissioned. It was some 45 acres in the middle of the park, and leaving it as a dormant reservoir didn't seem advisable. There were advocates at the time for converting the reservoir, filling it in, and converting it to a variety of active recreational facilities. Some called for a swimming pool, some called for playgrounds, some called for ball fields. Facilities that the park at that moment didn't yet provide. But there was a counter argument. There was also a proposal, I should say, to create a formal landscape, another sort of mall with flanking buildings. But the primary opposition to the active recreation ideas was to return to the Olmstedian vision and to create a great lawn. And this argument was advanced in the 1920s, the same time that Olmsted Jr. wrote the words that I mentioned at the outset, when the kind of cult of Olmsted was getting boosted significantly. It was getting boosted in part through the efforts of the professional societies of landscape architecture, which were established firmly in the 1920s. So landscape architects, the brotherhood that Olmsted Jr. referred to, were advocating to uphold the Olmsted vision. There were the Central Park Association, which was formed in 1925, was established to promote, I quote, the preservation and rehabilitation of Central Park in accordance with its original design as the greatest single work of art in the city of New York. And now, with the park, Boulders, fully inhabited, there was a cohort of very wealthy residents who took a special interest in the park and who were opposed or reluctant to see new developments which would attract unwelcome hordes into their midst. And so these wealthy residents formed a very significant stakeholder group that resisted the active recreation approach, and the forces rallied around the establishment of the Great Lawn. I should say that once the reservoir, the rectangular body of water that you see below the lake in the top of the screen of the left, was drained, it was in the Depression era another area where shanties were established. And then when Robert Moses came in as Parks Commissioner, appointed by Mayor LaGuardia in '34, he did what he so often did. He took the pre-existing plan and he implemented it. So he took the late 1920s plan for the lawn. And I got a little bit ahead of my slides here because what I wanted to make clear was that there was no return to an original design because the original design incorporated the Lower Reservoir. It was a pre-existing condition that Olmstead and Vox were obliged to incorporate in the park. So you see the old reservoir in this early plan, and you see a view of it here. So they weren't happy with it because its rectangular form, many other ways, was in conflict with their aesthetic values, but nevertheless, it was there. There was no return to an original plan. In this case, it could only have been a return to an interpretation in the 1920s of what Olmstead, they thought of it as Olmstead, not Olmstead and Vox would have wanted. And now you can see in the highlighted area here, the Great Lawn that was built, completed in 1936 by Moses. Again, just primarily taking the pre-existing proposal for the Great Lawn, ever so slightly modifying it by incorporating some playgrounds. For Moses himself was a great partisan of the active recreation movement, and one of the things he was responsible for during his term as Parks Commissioner was the development of playgrounds and ball fields in Central Park. So, return to the original concept, although it's still hard for me to read the Great Lawn really is faithful to that concept, but that was the notion. Another strategy, the third that I'll mention, is accepting historical accretions, of which the playgrounds, I think, are a beautiful example. The playgrounds were not a part of the original park. The first playground was built in 1926. There were a very considerable number that Moses built in the 1930s, and a few that were built subsequently, so that there are now 21 playgrounds in the park. And the Conservancy has conscientiously been restoring these playgrounds and updating them. There's no question of eliminating them. They're too fundamental to the residents' life, use of Central Park. And what has been done is exemplified in this original photograph of a Moses-designed park and its current recently rebuilt conditions in 2006 is to update the furniture and the whole approach, and to recognize changes in the approach to play around the adventure and exploratory theme. So accept historical accretions. And my last example of an approach is about the incorporation of modern approaches to ecology and environmental sustainability. Clearly, a set of scientific developments that were post-date the original era. And my example is the treatment of the loch, about which there are others in the room who will know a great deal more than me. But I've identified it in this, around the circle in the northern part of the park. And it was a set of open, smallish open bodies of water that ultimately fed into the Haarlem Mere. And what happened over time, this is a photograph from about 1880, and you can see the general openness of the water. But over time, it silted up and became increasingly narrow, and the whole concept of the open water was altered by the evolution of natural sort of landscape evolution. And this photograph from 1933, you can already see the constriction and change in the lock. And there was a debate in the 1990s about what to do, whether there should be a conservation of the part of the lock in its altered condition, very stream-like, or whether there should be an attempt to return to the original condition. And at that moment, it was kept in its stream-like condition. But my understanding is that the current effort is in not only opening it up a bit, but in making interventions to enrich habitat diversity and to consider the sustainability, the ecological sustainability. And so the installation, for example, of the boulders to preserve the flow of water, prevent soil erosion, are parts of this strategy. So my view is that our society has changed so dramatically, its needs so different, the advances in knowledge so significant, that it would be foolhardy not to recognize those changes. And these are factors that therefore weigh heavily against the primacy of the artist's original intent. And I'll just mention two, I think, very significant considerations. One is the impact of climate change on Central Park. This is a very serious risk. The Conservancy, I believe, commissioned a study from Columbia University in 2013 that you can see online that documented a great number of risks to the park. This slide shows you one of the fallen trees during Hurricane Sandy. In 2011, Hurricane Irene, during Hurricane Irene, the park lost 1,000 trees. During Hurricane Sandy, 1,100 trees were either destroyed or damaged. And the vulnerability of the urban forest in Central Park as the climate changes is extremely serious. There will be more rain and flooding, which will cause trees to be uprooted. There will be more toxic runoff from all the waters that fall. This toxic water will flow into the water bodies and harm aquatic life of those water bodies. Changes in the water cycle will affect the trees. Warmer temperatures, as you see the algae bloom on the Harlem Mere. The warmer temperatures will threaten the older trees and the newer seedlings. There'll be an increase in pests and diseases, which of course will threaten the plant life, and the dead zones in the water bodies, such as caused by the algae bloom, where oxygen deprivation will kill aquatic life. These are all different pieces of the climate change that is a reality and will become an increasing risk. So we absolutely need to harness our modern knowledge of the science of ecology to address this problem, this profound problem in the preservation of our park. And my second point is about the role that the park plays in our modern life that really transcends the imagination of anyone living in the mid-19th century. The city now has 8.6 million people, and the Central Park is its most important gathering place. It's the place where we have our memorials, our protests. It is a space of civic expression, of civic ritual. These 4 photographs, peace protest on the top left, on the bottom left, a concert to fight nuclear proliferation. You of course recognize the Christo flags and the visit of the Pope, 4 examples of this very important role that the park plays. And as I'm sure you felt when you walked through the park, for example, beneath the flags, it was an uplifting moment that could only have had the kind of, I think, public impact because it was in our public realm, because it was in this park. And just like a protest rally, as you see here, is a demonstration of the critical role the park plays in enacting our democracy. It is part of our practice of citizenship, our need for free expression. So for these reasons, I conclude that while the artist's intention, especially in a case where we have truly great artists producing a masterpiece, deserves very serious consideration and needs to be balanced in relation to other factors, I would argue that the present-day needs of our city, of our residents in experiencing this extraordinary public space become more significant.